Please join me in welcoming Greta Christina.
So is this, can you hear me? Is this sound okay? Thank you so much, August, for that introduction, and thank you so much to the Secular Student Alliance for inviting me to be here tonight. And collectively, but also individually, August and Liz and Jesse and Nate and Nick have just put together a really incredible conference. The organization on this has been astonishing. I'm really impressed, and it's very inspiring to me that the Secular Student Alliance, of all the godless group, organizations there are, that this particular group, because it's so important, because it's y'all, it's young people, and it's students, is so well organized and so enthusiastically organized, that gives me tremendous hope for this movement. So thank you so much for putting this together. It's really job well done. I realize that this kind of job is thankless, so thank you. A quick housekeeping, I guess, before I start. I gave a smaller version of this talk at the regional conference, the regional SSA conference at Stanford and in Harvard. And some of you may have heard that. I promise you, this is the extended disco remix. There's a lot of material here that you haven't heard before, so please have patience with the stuff that you have heard. So today I am talking about what the atheist movement can learn from the LGBT movement, what we can learn from the history of that movement. The atheist movement is already modeling ourselves in many ways on the LGBT movement, and we should. The parallels between the two movements are sometimes eerie. They're both serious social change movements, advocating for greater tolerance of a marginalized community, as well as advocating for significant changes within mainstream society. They're both communities that people generally come out into as adults. Certainly some of us were raised non-believers, but for the most part, the atheist movement is a community that people come out into as opposed to being an identity that people grow up with, like being black or being Jewish. And of course, the opposition to both movements is largely driven by religion. And there's lots of other parallels between the two movements, which I'll be getting into throughout the talk. And since the LGBT movement is roughly 35 years, by my estimation, ahead of where the atheist movement is right now, I think that the atheist movement right now is about where the LGBT movement was in the early 70s, right after the Stonewall riots. I think we have a unique chance to learn from that movement, both from its successes and from its failures. So a quick question before I move on. Who here knows about the Stonewall riots? Okay, good. A lot of you do. For those of you who don't, I want to give you a quick bit of history because it's important. The Stonewall riots happened in June of 1969, and they're what the gay pride parades that happen in June around the country and around the world are commemorating. And in June of 1969 in New York City, the police were raiding gay bars and shutting them down, just like they had done hundreds of times for years. But this time, in June of 1969, at a gay bar called the Stonewall Inn, the gay men and lesbians and bisexuals and trans people fought back. And when I say fought back, I mean literally fought back. This was like not fought back like they carried signs and banners. They threw rocks and bricks at cops. These were riots, and they lasted for days. If anybody tells you that confrontation is not an effective form of social change, there's, by the way, an excellent documentary that just came out called Stonewall Uprising, if you're interested in the history of the Stonewall riots and where it came from and what happened. It's really worth watching. And the Stonewall riots are generally considered to be what sparked the modern LGBT rights movement. Now, this is to some extent an oversimplification. There had been a gay movement before Stonewall, but after Stonewall, the movement quickly became much more visible, more vocal, more activist, better organized, better mobilized, and much less apologetic. Very much like the current atheist movement. There certainly was an atheist movement before the so-called New Atheism, with a number of different organizations and groups. And like the pre-Stonewall gay movement, these groups have been building a foundation that's made it possible for the so-called New Atheist movement to take off. And yet, while the New Atheist movement is clearly not really all that new, It is undeniable that something new and something big has been happening in atheism in the last few years. Atheism has become far more visible, more vocal, more activist, better organized, etc. The movement has changed dramatically. It is never going to be the same. So this is why I say that the atheist movement is about 35 years behind the LGBT movement, that we're about where the gay movement was in the early 70s, just after Stonewall. And that's why I think we have such a rare opportunity to learn from the history of that movement. So, what can we learn from the history of that movement? I'm so glad you asked. Probably the single most important thing that atheists can learn from the history of the LGBT movement is to encourage visibility and coming out of the closet, and to work harder on making the atheist movement a safer place to come out into. Very early in the LGBT movement, it became clear that coming out is the single most powerful political act that gay people can take. Consistently, polls show that the single factor most likely to make people support gay rights is whether they know a gay person personally, or to be more accurate, whether they know that they know a gay person personally. And this is a lesson that the atheist movement has been taking to heart, with the atheist bus ads and billboard campaigns, proudly telling people all over the world that you can be good without God. And with the Out campaign, encouraging atheist bloggers to identify as atheists with the scarlet letter on their blogs, etc. We're doing an excellent job with visibility. We have gone from being on pretty much nobody's radar to being a very hot topic at water coolers and op-ed columns and, among news reporters in a very, very short time. We went to from 0 to 60 on visibility like that. And more atheists are coming out every day. But I think we're doing a less consistent job of making the atheist movement a safe place to land once people do come out. In the post-Stonewall days of the LGBT movement, there was a massive blossoming of LGBT community centers, bookstores, coffee houses, political groups, bars, bowling leagues, everything. Coming out as queer often meant alienating friends and family, and so queers formed our own social support networks to take the place of the ones that rejected us. Now, the atheist movement has not been as strong about this. Online, we have been. We have done an excellent job of providing online communities for atheists, and that's not trivial. I sometimes think, as far as the LGBT movement has come in the last 40 years, where would we have been if we had had the internet in the 70s? It just boggles the mind. And the fact that we do have this online community makes a huge difference, especially to non-believers who are isolated, who are in small towns, who are in parts of the country and parts of the world where, where their overwhelming assumption is of religion, and where coming out as atheist is dangerous if, actually physically dangerous if not socially dangerous. So we've done a really good job of providing online community, and I think that that's important. I don't want to underestimate it, but we haven't done as good a job at providing in-the-flesh support networks to replace the churches and synagogues and mosques and covens and so on, and the sense of belonging and common purpose that they provide. And I will include myself in that. I am much better at participating in the online atheist movement than I am at actually showing up at my local meetings. Showing up at local meetings is hard. You have to get up off the sofa. But I do think that one of the things we can learn from the LGBT movement is to remember how difficult coming out is. We need to remember that when we encourage people to rethink religion and consider atheism, we're asking a lot. And we're not just asking people to reshape the philosophical foundation of their lives and to let go of a major source of comfort that they've relied on for years. We are asking that. But in addition to that, we're also asking them, in many cases, to alienate their friends and their family and their community. And I'd like to see us do a better job of providing something to replace that with. I'd like to see us do more to create non-virtual, actual in-the-flesh communities that provide guidance and counseling, safety nets, places for rituals and rites of passage, activities for families and friends, avenues for charitable and social justice work, events that are inspiring, events that are fun, ongoing companionship and continuity, all these things that churches and synagogues and mosques and covens, etc., provide. Now, There are atheist groups doing these things, of course, and since this is a conference for the Secular Student Alliance, I think it's important to point out that some of the groups that have been doing the best work in this area have been the student groups. In fact, I would say that the student groups have been among the most important exceptions to this rule. The student groups have been providing a great deal of in-the-flesh support and community for fledgling atheists. So I'd like to encourage the leaders of those groups to continue doing that kind of community work even after you leave school. The stuff that Sharon talked about earlier, about take the work that you're doing now. When you leave school, don't just leave it behind, carry it with you. And from what I've been hearing from Liz's talk earlier, even student groups often have continuity problems. They tend to fold if the driving force behind them has been a strong leader who has the temerity to graduate and go and have a life. So I'd like to encourage student groups to be aware of that phenomenon, prepare, make plans for smooth transitions, and create strong structures that will last, even when the individuals in them move on. And since there are people here tonight who aren't from student groups, and since all the people here who are from student groups someday, hopefully, won't be anymore, I'd like to encourage atheists who aren't part of student groups to do what they can to partner with those groups. Again, the fact that student atheist groups are blossoming around the country at the rate that they have been, and around the country and around the world, the fact that rates of atheism are so much higher among people who are 25 and under, that is one of the most encouraging signs that I've seen in this movement. And I think that non-student atheist groups can work with student groups to co-sponsor events, to mentor and help provide continuity, to give the benefit of our experience, just to provide a little financial support. If we want this movement to flourish, and if we want to provide a safe place to land for people who are questioning their religious beliefs, supporting student groups, if you're not in a student group, is a really great way to do that. And it's a really great way to encourage student atheists to continue their atheist activism after they leave school, and it's a great way to bring new blood into your own group. So moving on, there's another lesson that I think atheists can learn from the LGBT movement, and this is one it took the gay movement a little while to learn. And that is to let firebrands be firebrands, and let diplomats be diplomats. We need to recognize that not all activists pursue activism in the same way. We need to recognize that using both more confrontational and more diplomatic approaches makes us a stronger movement, and that both of these approaches used together are more powerful than either approach used alone. To some extent, the LGBT movement is still learning this lesson, but we've become much better about it than we used to be, and our movement has become a lot stronger as a result. Here's an example. In the queer activist movement of the 80s and 90s, loud, angry street activist groups like ACT UP and Queer Nation used to accuse the more mainstream lobbying groups of assimilationism, compromise, selling out, all that stuff. I did that too. I'm as guilty as anybody else. I used to go, damn the HRC, Human Rights Champagne Fund, they're not out there in the streets doing the work we are. And the mild-mannered groups often accuse the street activists of being overly idealistic, alienating potential allies, making their own jobs harder. I'm sure this is all really sounding familiar to all of you. But when we look at those years in retrospect, it becomes clear that both methods together were far more effective than either method would have been alone. Part of this is simply that different methods of activism speak to different people. Some folks are better able to hear a quiet, sympathetic voice. Other folks are better able to hear a passionate cry for justice. Some people are, in fact, good at hearing mockery. There's always this thing about, you shouldn't make fun of religion because that just alienates people. P.Z. Myers gets letters every week telling him, you helped convince me about atheism, and you making fun of religion helped wake me up. So it can work. Different people hear different things. So when both kinds of voices are heard, or rather all kinds of voices, because difference is much more of a spectrum rather than a simple either-or dichotomy, more people will be reached. And the good cop, bad cop dynamic should not be underestimated. Cops use it for a reason. It works. Again, in the queer movement of the 80s and 90s, the street activists got attention. got on the news, raised general visibility and awareness of the issues. If ACT UP did nothing else in the world, they got people saying the word AIDS when they weren't saying it. And then the polite negotiators could then raise a more polite, nuanced form of hell, knowing that the people they were working with had at least a baseline awareness of their issues. It's like they'd heard the word AIDS, they'd heard the word gay. They didn't have to do education from square one. And when the street activists presented more extremist, hardline demands, that made the polite negotiators seem a lot more reasonable in comparison. And the line between an extremist position and a moderate one kept getting moved in our direction. We see this working today, especially in the fight for same-sex marriage. This fight for same-sex marriage has had a lot of ups and downs, and while I'm confident that we're going to win in the end, I also am quite sure that it's going to be a long, hard fight. But one of the effects of that fight has been that it's made supporting civil unions and domestic partnerships seem like the moderate position. Even like the conservative position, like, moderate Republicans are saying, well, we can't have marriage, but okay, domestic partnerships, that's all right, it's a legal contract, we can do that. That was not true 10 years ago. Moderate Republicans, moderate Democrats, they weren't saying, yay, civil unions. And the fight for same-sex marriage moved what the center was. So I'm not saying that we shouldn't debate our tactical differences. On any given issue, it is sometimes worth debating whether diplomacy or confrontation or a combination will be a more effective tactic in that particular case. Those are debates worth having. I'm not saying we shouldn't have them. But I would like us to stop treating those debates as if they were larger questions of morality or character that have to be resolved in one direction or the other once and for all. We do what we're inspired to do, and we do what we're good at. Some of us are good at passionate confrontational idealism. Some of us are good at sympathy with our opponents, and some of us are good at a mix of those approaches. Some of us want to do one thing one day and another thing the other day. There's times when I don't want to have the fight, so I write nice things for a week, and then I recharge my batteries, and then I get mad again. And since the multi-pronged approach to activism is so much more effective than any one prong alone, it seems absurd to insist that everyone else in the movement has to be working the exact same prong that we're working. The diplomatic atheists need to stop trying to shut up the firebrands and stop accusing them, us, of alienating people. And the firebrand atheists need to stop accusing the diplomats of being wusses. It is a waste of everybody's time and energy. So hang on a sec. So speaking of waste of everyone's time and energy, there's another very important lesson that the godless movement can learn from the LGBT movement, and that's to not waste our time squabbling about language. We need to let godless people define themselves in whatever language they want to. There is again an eerie parallel between the non-theist movement and the LGBT movement here. And it's a similarity between two relationships. The relationship between homosexuals and bisexuals on the one hand, and the relationship between atheists and agnostics on the other. So I personally identify as bisexual. And in the past, I had to put, yes, yay, bisexuals. And in the past, I've had to put up with a fair amount of crap from gay men and lesbians telling me that I'm, quote, really lesbian and just won't admit it. This is really not helpful, to say the least. The question of how to name your sexual identity is extremely personal, and different factors have different weight for different people. I'm a Kinsey 5. That's on the Kinsey sexual orientation scale of 0 to 6. 0 means being entirely homosexual. Sorry, other way around. 0 means being entirely heterosexual. 6 it means entirely homosexual. I'm about a Kinsey 5, 4.5. Mainly oriented towards women, but with some interest in men. And I call myself bisexual because, for me, the interest in men is not trivial. It included important relationships from my past. It's an important part of how I see the world now. But for some other Kinsey 5 or 4.5, that some interest in the opposite sex might not be that important. You know, it's just not, you know, yeah, they sometimes are like people of the opposite sex, but it's just not that big a deal to them. It's not a central part of how they see themselves sexually or romantically. So they might call themselves gay or lesbian, which is totally their right, just like it's my right to call myself bisexual. These terms don't have clear definitions that everybody agrees on. There is not a perfect bisexual in a vacuum in the Smithsonian that we all compare ourselves to. And within reason, we have the right to use this language in a way that makes sense for us. Does everybody see where I'm going with this? Let's look at the Richard Dawkins belief scale, which goes from 1 to 7, 1 being absolute certainty that there is a God, 7 being absolute certainty that there isn't. I'm about a 6 on the Dawkins scale, as is in fact Dawkins himself, and I call myself an atheist, because to me that glimmer of uncertainty is not important. You know, it's hypothetically possible that I'm wrong, it's hypothetically possible that there might be a God, it's hypothetically possible that there might be unicorns too. It's not keeping me up at night, it's not important to me. But for somebody else who's a 6 on the Dawkins scale, that glimmer of uncertainty might really matter to them. Even if they have exactly the same amount of doubt that I do, the fact of that doubt might be really important, an important part of how they identify. So even though we're in the same place on the Dawkins scale, it's totally reasonable for them to call themselves agnostic while I call myself an atheist. Again, there's not a perfect atheist in a vacuum in the Smithsonian. This language is imprecise, the language is still evolving, and the power to name ourselves is too important for us to try to take it away from each other. So in the same way that gays and lesbians have, for the most part, learned to quit telling bisexuals that they're really gay or lesbian and just won't admit it, I think atheists really need to quit telling agnostics that they're really atheist and just won't admit it. By the same token, just like bisexuals have to quit saying everyone's basically bisexual, I used to say that, I'm so sorry, if I ever told you you're basically bisexual, I apologize, I was an idiot. Agnostics have to shut up about how most atheists are really agnostic, and how true atheism is as much a belief system as religion, etc. Atheists and agnostics are natural allies, as are humanists, skeptics, free thinkers, materialists, naturals, brights, etc. Much like gays and lesbians and bisexuals and transgendered people are natural allies. We shouldn't waste our time and energy squabbling because you say tomato and I say tomato. So moving on, actually taking another drink of water and then moving on. There's another lesson that the atheist movement can learn from the LGBT movement. An extremely important lesson, and one that I cannot emphasize enough and that I'm going to spend a certain amount of time on. And this is a lesson that atheists can learn not from the successes of the LGBT movement, but from one of our biggest failures, a failure that has come back to bite us on the ass time and time again. Atheists need to work now on making our movement more diverse and making it more welcoming and inclusive of women and people of color. And by now, I mean now. I mean 5 years ago. We need to start on this now so we don't get set into patterns and vicious circles and self-fulfilling prophecies that in 10 or 20 years will be damn near impossible to fix. So, what can the atheists learn from the LGBT movement? The LGBT movement screwed this up badly. The early LGBT movement was very much dominated by gay white men. The public representatives of that movement were mostly gay white men. Most organizations were led by gay white men. And the gay white male leaders of that movement had some seriously bad race and gender stuff. Treating gay men of color as fetishistic others, objects of desire rather than members of the community, and treating lesbians as alien others, inscrutable and trivial. And we're paying for it today. Relations between lesbians and gay men, between white queers and queers of color, are often strained at best. Conversations in our movement about race and gender often take place in a decades-old minefield of bitterness and rancor where nobody can say anything right. And we still, after decades, have a very strong tendency to put gay white men front and center as the most visible, iconic representatives of our community. And this makes it hard on everyone in the LGBT movement, women and men of all races. It creates rifts that make our community weaker. It means that we have to spend time dealing with it as opposed to actually doing work out in the world. We have to fix these problems within our own movement. And it has a seriously bad impact on our ability to make effective social change. For instance, the LGBT movement has a profoundly impaired ability to shift homophobic attitudes in the black communities, since those communities can claim entirely fairly that the gay community doesn't care about black people and hasn't made an effort to deal with our racism. It's very hard to deal with that accusation when it's right. We screwed this up. We still screw this up. We are paying for our screw-ups. Atheists have a chance to not do that. The atheist movement is currently largely dominated by white men, especially in positions of visibility and leadership, and many atheists resist seeing this as a problem that we need to take action on. These people aren't usually overtly racist or sexist, usually. Mostly they're not. They're not saying we don't want women in our movement. They're not saying we don't want people of color in their movement. They just don't see this as their responsibility, and they don't see it as particularly important. So I want to take a little time to talk about why it's important and how exactly these patterns get set. I want to talk about how, with the best of intentions, both individuals and a movement as a whole can become exclusionary without ever meaning to. I want to talk about why it isn't enough to just not be overtly racist or sexist, why we have to take positive action to counter this trend. I want to talk about why the atheist movement needs to make this a priority for pragmatic reasons as well as ethical ones. And I want to talk about what specifically, practically, we can do about it. Now, my experience in talking with student groups is that, for the most part, students get the why. They get why diversity is important, but they're sometimes stymied as to what to do about it, which is reasonable. Almost anybody doing political or social change activism gets stymied about what to do about this. And it's not like I have a magic wand that's like, here, this is what to do about this, and in 2 years, this is all going to go away. But I do have some observations, both about how diversity can get mucked up and about how it can be moved forward. And these observations are taken, among other places, from the ugly and painful experiences of the LGBT movement. So for starters, how do these unfortunate trends for a movement to get dominated by white men get ingrained? First, we have unconscious bias. Even with the best of conscious intentions, people tend to be more comfortable and more trusting with people who are more like them. And this is all people. All people are like this. This is a basic human tendency. It's very hardwired. We trust people who we see as our family and our tribe. It's the reason behind affirmative action. It's been very well documented that when doing hiring, without any conscious intention to do so, people are more likely to trust and respect and therefore hire people who look like them. And that's why if bosses are white men, they're going to hire other white men. And then when they become the bosses, they're going to hire other white men. That's how this gets perpetuated. One of the ways that this gets perpetuated. So if a movement starts out, for whatever reason, being mostly made up of and led by white men, and if there's no conscious, proactive attempt to seek out and welcome people of color and women, that movement will have a very strong tendency to continue being dominated by white men. Another way that unconscious bias can work, because white men are used to being in charge and are used to being seen as being in charge, they often feel more comfortable stepping up to the plate when it comes to positions of leadership and visibility. I was recently talking with the organizers of a group that works to get women to run for political office, and they said that the single factor that makes women more likely to run for office is simply having somebody ask them to do it. Women and people of color are just not socialized to think of ourselves as leaders, but when somebody takes a simple step of asking, of saying, you would be great on the school board, you would be great on the steering committee, you would be great on the board of directors, why don't you do it? That simple act by itself can go a very long way to increasing the diversity of an organization. So if that's something that you're looking at, if you're going, we have a membership base, it's a little bit diverse, but there's not that many people of color or women in our leadership, and you're going, how can we do that? Ask them. Just say, would you like to be on the steering committee? Would you like to be the treasurer? Would you like to run for president? What's more, people can have racist or sexist attitudes without being conscious of them. You don't need to be a torch-wielding member of the KKK or Operation Rescue to say or think dumb things about race or gender. As somebody who has said and thought plenty of dumb things in my time, I speak from experience. A lot of racism and sexism is not grossly overt. It's subtle. We often aren't even aware of it until it's called to our attention. But you can be sure that the people on the receiving end of those attitudes are aware of it, and it can put them off from participating in a community that they might otherwise be drawn to. And then we have the problem of focus. People have a very natural, understandable tendency to focus on issues that concern them most directly. And if a movement, however unintentionally, is being dominated by white men, then the movement will tend to focus its energy on issues that largely concern white men, at the expense of issues that concern women and people of color. As one example, I'll cite a tendency I talked about earlier, the tendency of the atheist movement to provide an internet community more than providing in-the-flesh communities. It's a completely understandable tendency. Internet communities are easy to form, and they're easy to join, and they're easy to perpetuate. But it's a tendency that ignores the powerful social bonds that churches provide in the African-American communities, and that neglects the isolation that many African-American atheists feel when they leave those churches, and that fails to offer a replacement. Some more specific and pragmatic examples. If our meetings and events and conferences are too expensive, if they don't provide childcare, if they're not near public transportation, those are very nuts and bolts ways of placing the focus on the needs of white male atheists over the needs of women and people of color. And a particular hobby horse of mine, have your t-shirts in women's styles as well as men's? And if you can't afford, and here's a thought, if you can't afford to have both, it's like we have to print up t-shirts and we can only afford to do one, make it the women's ones. Men can wear, if women can wear boxy men's t-shirts that don't look good on us, men can bloody well wear t-shirts that are designed for women. Didn't know that was going to be such a big applause line. Okay, that's an issue. Women's t-shirts. Okay, so then we have everybody's favorite good time, self-fulfilling prophecies. Let's pretend just for a moment that these other things that I've been talking about, that unconscious bias and an unconscious tendency to focus on issues that matter to you, let's pretend those aren't happening. Let's pretend that the atheist movement is largely and most visibly white and male just by pure random dumb luck. Obviously, I don't think that's true, but just for the sake of argument, let's pretend. Even if that were so, the tendency of the atheist movement to be dominated by white men would still tend to perpetuate itself because of self-fulfilling prophecies. Remember what we talked about before. People are more comfortable with people who are like them, and that isn't just true for white men. That's true for women, and it's true for people of color. So if a movement is already largely made up of white men and has white men as the most visible representatives, women of people of color are just not as likely to join up. They, or I should say we, are more likely to feel like fish out of water. We're less likely to see the movement as having anything to do with us. So even if the predominant whiteness and maleness of the atheist movement had happened purely by accident, it would still tend towards a cycle of self-fulfilling prophecy. And plus, of course, all of this is assuming that there is no overt racism and sexism in the atheist movement, an assumption that is not always warranted. I haven't seen a ton of overt racism and sexism, but I've seen some, and it does happen. So those are some of the ways that largely white, largely male movements stay largely white and male, even if nobody intended it to happen. But here is the good news. I'm going to make you wait on the good news. A lot of this is fixable, or at least it's addressable. And it's much, much easier to address in the early stages of a movement than it is down the line, after patterns have been established, after bad feelings have had decades to fester. Again, a lesson that the LGBT movement dearly wishes it had learned several decades ago. So how do we fix this? I could go on about this all night. I'm not going to, but I think this is a conversation we can continue to have. But this is really just a starting point for this conversation. Let's start with the self-fulfilling prophecy bit. Self-fulfilling prophecies can seem beyond hope, but that's just not the case here. There are specific practical steps that the atheist movement could take to derail this cycle, or at least to mitigate it. And self-perpetuating cycles can also be used for the power of good, as well as the power of evil. For starters, atheist organizations can make a conscious, proactive effort to reach out to women and people of color, and to get the women and people of color they have now into positions of greater prominence and visibility and leadership. Atheist conference organizers can make an effort to get more women and people of color as speakers, both speaking on issues of race and gender, and just speaking about atheism generally. Thank you again, by the way, to the SSA for inviting me to speak here today. It's good diversity. Noun failure there. And I think an important part of that is you don't necessarily just want to ask women and people of color to speak about gender or race, because that also has a tendency to sort of isolate them, us, and it sort of emphasizes that otherness, that alienness, that we are only about our race or our gender. Get women and people of color to talk about the history of science, the history of the relationship between science and atheism, or about anything. It doesn't have to be about race or gender. Atheist speakers bureaus can make an effort to recruit women and people of color. Atheist writers can make an effort to cite the contributions and ideas of female atheists and atheists of color, both from the history of free thought and from our current movement. Atheist bloggers can make an effort to cite and link to atheist blogs run by women and people of color, and to include them in their blog roles. Atheist leaders, writers, speakers, etc., can make an effort to address specific concerns of women and people of color in the atheist community. All atheists, just individually, can speak out when we see racism and sexism in the movement. I'm sure you get the idea. And as these efforts take hold and the movement becomes more inclusive, with more diversity in our leadership, more women and people of color will feel comfortable and welcomed and want to participate in the movement. Again, inclusivity can also be a self-perpetuating cycle. Some organizations and bloggers and writers and leaders are already doing this. Good for them. Kudos to you if you're doing that. More of us need to be doing it, and those of us who are doing it need to be doing it more. And the unconscious bias thing isn't hopeless either. It can also be addressed by taking positive steps to make our movement more inclusive. One of the great things about having a more diverse community is that your unconscious biases get called into question, partly just by seeing counterexamples on a regular basis, and partly because there'll be more people around to call you on it when you're being a jerk, and people who will feel more comfortable and safe calling you on it because they feel like they have backup because there's other people who are like them in the community. And again, this can turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy for good instead of for evil. The more conscious a community gets of its biases and the more it works to overcome them, the more welcoming that community will be to a more diverse population, and then the more diverse it becomes, the more we get our unconscious biases overturned. And ditto with focus. The more women and people of color we have in our movement, especially in positions of leadership, the more that the specific concerns of female atheists and atheists of color will be addressed in our organizations. And the more these concerns are heard and addressed, the more inviting our community will be to a wider and more diverse population. Again, self-perpetuating cycles, power for good, use them. Before I move on, I want to mention a couple of other specific things that we can do about all this. A very crucial one, and one that I think is really hard for a lot of people, and I will include myself in that, is when someone brings up the subject of racism or sexism in the atheist movement, listen. Don't just get defensive and reflexively reject the idea out of hand. Don't say, not my fault, la, 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 I can't hear you. We don't have to agree with the criticism. I often see accusations of sexism that I personally, as a woman and as a feminist, think are crap. You don't have to automatically, anytime somebody says this is racist or sexist, you don't automatically have to agree. But I think that we should listen. I think that we should think about it for more than 10 seconds and not just react out of defensive emotion before we decide whether the criticism has merit. And one last strategy bit before I move on. Those of us who are already on board, those of us who've been sitting here for the last 10 minutes going, yes, 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 I get it. Diversity is important. I understand why it's important. I get it. Those of us who already think this is important and that it needs to be dealt with sooner rather than later, we need to keep talking about it. And it's especially important for a good amount of the talking about gender to be done by men, and for a good amount of the talking about race to be done by white people. And I want to give an example here of how and why this works. And this is a very positive example of something that I think the atheist movement has been doing very, very well. One of the first things that my wife Ingrid and I noticed when we started hanging out in the atheist blogosphere was that on the rare occasions when somebody in a comment thread would say something stupid or bigoted about gay people, straight people would automatically be all over them in droves. We, me and Ingrid and other LGBT people in the atheist blogs, didn't always have to be the ones speaking out about homophobia. We didn't usually have to be the ones speaking out about homophobia. We could sit back and watch straight people do it. And that was amazing. And that was so important. I cannot begin to tell you. That's probably a central part of why I am so invested in the atheist movement and why I feel so comfortable here. There's something Ingrid, my wife, by the way, Ingrid says hi. Ingrid really wanted to be here at this conference. She couldn't get off of work, but Ingrid says hi. And something Ingrid often says about the atheist movement is that it is the only progressive social movement that she's ever been in where she felt that straight people had her back. And that is huge. That just by itself, the fact that when some jackass on Pharyngula said something homophobic, straight people were the ones who were speaking out about it, made us feel incredibly welcomed into the atheist movement and made us want to be much more active and enthusiastic participants in it. The atheist movement generally does a very good job of this with sexual orientation. You may notice I'm talking about diversity, I'm talking about race, I'm talking about gender. I'm not talking about sexual orientation. That's because I think most of the time we get it. And I think we need to expand that. So yes, a round of applause. Thank you, atheist movement, for not being homophobic jackasses and for really getting and welcoming it about LGBT people. And I think we need to expand that into the arenas of race and gender. So we have to keep talking about this. Making this case within the atheist movement is kind of like making the case for atheism outside the atheist movement. It's like water on rock. The ideas can take time to penetrate, so we have to be persistent, and we have to keep this issue on everybody's radar. So why? Why should we care? Why should it matter so much that the atheist movement is largely white and largely male with so many white men in positions of leadership? Shouldn't we just be pretending, acting as if it's a race-blind, gender-blind world, and, should we even be noticing race and gender? And in any case, don't we have other issues to worry about? So I'm going to answer, as I so often do, with my unique blend of pie-eyed idealism and cold-blooded Machiavellian practicality. The idealistic reasons of why we should do this is because it's the right thing to do. Because women atheists and atheists of color matter just as much as white male atheists. Because religion hurts women and people of color just as much as it does white men, and in many ways more so. Because women and people of color who are potential non-believers are just as important as white men who are potential non-believers, and it's just as crucial to give them a safe place to land when they leave religion, as safe a place as we give to anybody else. Because we are the reality-based community, we like to call ourselves, and pretending that racism and sexism does not exist is not a way to make racism and sexism not exist. We have to acknowledge the reality of it and deal with it rather than pretending that it's not real. Because fighting racism and sexism makes us all better people and makes the world a better place. Because this conversation should not be about us and them. It should be about us, all of us. Atheists and agnostics and skeptics and humanists and free thinkers and non-believers of all races and all genders. Because we are all us, all part of this movement, and we should all be treated as if we matter. So the Machiavellian pragmatic reasons. because it will make our movement stronger. Numbers will make us stronger, and making the movement more inclusive will bring in more numbers. Thinking through our ideas will make us more stronger, and making the movement more inclusive will challenge us all to think more clearly. And diversity itself will make us stronger. It brings new ideas to the table. It multiplies our abilities to make alliances with other progressive political movements. It brings a broader range of ideas and viewpoints to the public debates, and it makes us not look like elitist jerks in the public eye. So to bring it back to the larger topic, when it comes to inclusivity and diversity, what can the atheist movement learn from the LGBT movement? I will say again, the early LGBT movement screwed this up, and we are paying for our screw-ups today. If you're still wondering why this is important, talk to anybody who's seriously involved in LGBT politics and ask them, if you could get into a time machine and go back to 1970 and get the early leaders of the post-Stonewall movement to deal with race and sex, would you do it? I can guarantee you that just about every one of them would fervently respond, yes, for the sweet love of Loki and all the gods in Valhalla. If we could go back in time and not screw that up, we would. And that's true of every progressive social change movement I can think of, the feminist movement, the labor movement, the environmental movement, any. Talk to leaders of any social change movement. They're going to tell you the same thing. We have a chance in the atheist movement to not screw this up. We have a chance to start dealing with it now, so it's less of a problem in 10 or 20 years, and we're not wasting our time and energy trying to fix then what we could be fixing now. Let's learn from the mistakes of the LGBT movement as well as from its successes, and let's take advantage of that chance. So finally, there's one more lesson that the atheist movement can learn from the history of the LGBT movement. Okay, there's lots more. I could talk about this for hours. You get a drink in my hand, I will corner you, and I will bore you to tears about this topic. I'll say, let me tell you what the atheist movement can learn about the LGBT movement. Start point one. But there's one more for today, since I realize that we have limited time. And that lesson is this. We need to be prepared, not this year, probably not even in a few years, but eventually and sooner than we might think, for atheism to become mainstream. And when that happens, we need to really, really be prepared to let go of any ideas we might have about atheists being special, about atheists being more independent, better at critical thinking, less willing to just believe what we're taught, better informed about religion, more thoughtful about ethics and the meaning of life, more anything. Many atheists have a very strong sense of pride and specialness about our atheism, and I am one of them. And there's a degree to which, right now at least, I think that this sense of pride and specialness is warranted. Right now, the contemporary atheist movement is amazing. I am inspired and enlightened and blown away by it on a daily basis. I think that contemporary atheist movement is largely, although far from entirely, made up of people who are smart, thoughtful, ethical, caring, passionate, honest, brave, really, really funny, and able to think for themselves to an amazing degree. And I think that that amazingness is doomed. And more to the point, I think that it should be doomed. Here's the gay analogy. When I was coming out as bisexual in the 80s, coming out was a really hard thing to do. It often meant alienating your friends and family, facing bigotry and social condemnation, losing jobs and homes and children, etc. And you had to be a special person to do it. I'm sorry if that sounds arrogant, but it's true. You had to come out as an LGBT person in the 80s and earlier, you had to have a strong personality, an independent spirit, a huge amount of self-confidence, a passion for social change, a vision for the future, a wicked sense of humor, a metric buttload of courage, and an unbelievably thick skin. And that's even more true the further back in time you go. People who were out as LGBT in the 60s and 70s, they were phenomenal. And they had amazing courage, and they were incredible. I don't think I could have done it, and I bow down to them. So it was really easy to be deceived into thinking that there was something inherently special about being queer. After all, when you looked around you in the LGBT community, what you saw everywhere was totally amazing people. And it was easy to forget that the difficulty of coming out is a very powerful self-selecting filter for amazingness. And as a result, there was often a thread of self-satisfied elitism woven into all that amazingness. The queer theory crowd especially was always going on about how queerness represented this radical paradigm shift and how we were the cutting edge of a new frontier of humanity and how being queer represented a brand new way of looking at gender and sexuality and our bodies and how the liberation of queerness was going to solve world hunger and fill the world with cute puppies. I mean, really, you have no idea. It's just the cute cats, everything. I mean, it's like, it's when the world fully accepts queerness, it's like rainbows and unicorns. I mean, it was embarrassing, the stuff that we said. But as the movement progressed and as coming out became easier and safer, the amazing specialness of the LGBT community became less special and amazing, which is exactly as it should be. It's sometimes said that the goal of any liberation movement is to make itself obsolete. That goal has not yet been reached in the LGBT movement, very far from it. But as the movement has progressed, as it's become easier to come out, the LGBT community is looking more and more just like the regular human community. Not overwhelmingly populated by strong, independent, funny, brave, self-confident, thick-skinned visionaries, but populated largely by regular folks who just want to get on with their lives. Being queer has become increasingly normal, increasingly no big deal, increasingly not the central defining feature of every LGBT person's identity. And people have been able to come out of the closet now who would not have had the strength and courage to do it 20 or 30 years ago. And good for them. That is exactly how it should be. So, what does this have to do with the atheist movement? I bet you see where I'm going with this. Right now, coming out as an atheist is pretty hard. And for me in San Francisco, it's relatively easy, with my godless family backing me up and San Francisco being a fairly progressive city, but it's still not super easy. I mean, among other things, I've lost friendships. I've lost some pretty close friendships, and I've had other friendships very seriously strained by my coming out as an atheist and by my outspoken atheist activism. And the death threats have not been a picnic. And I'm one of the lucky ones, apart from the death threats. I haven't been disowned by my family. I haven't been harassed at my job. I haven't been kicked out of school. I haven't had my property vandalized. I haven't been denied custody of my kids. I haven't had any of the really, really bad things that happen to atheists in this country because of their atheism. And I definitely haven't had the bad things that happen to atheists around the world where they actually get put into prison and threatened with death or killed because of their atheism. So coming out as an atheist today is hard. And again, not to sound totally arrogant here, but you have to be a pretty amazing person to do it. You have to have a strong personality, an independent spirit, huge amount of self-confidence, passion for social change, vision for the future, wicked sense of humor, metric buttload of courage, unbelievably thick skin. And as a result, the atheist community is amazing. Aggravating to the point of madness sometimes. As was the LGBT community of the 80s and 90s. Boy, when you have a community full of people who are really strong, independent, characters, that has its challenges. But still, totally amazing. I love the atheist movement to pieces. But that is not going to last. Here's an specific example of what I'm talking about. There have been a lot of debates in the atheist blogosphere about the morality of atheists versus believers. And a lot of atheists insist that atheist morality is inherently more mature than theistic morality. They'll argue that theistic morality is based on fear of punishment and desire for reward, and atheist morality is based on a fundamental innate sense of compassion and sense of justice. And I can see why people would think that. Because right now, the atheist community is largely made up of people with very mature, very well thought out senses of morality. We've had to be. The assumption that morality, it comes from religion, is very deeply ingrained in our culture. And those of us who have rejected religion have had to think long and hard and carefully about what our morality is and why. Many theists have also thought about this carefully, in much the same way that many straight people in the 80s and 90s had a thoughtful understanding of gender and sexuality. But coming out as an atheist today means having that thoughtfulness thrust upon us. But if we're successful, if we succeed in making a world in which being an out atheist is relatively easy, or at least easier than it is now, that's going to change. As we succeed in making the world an easier place to be an out atheist, we're going to see more atheists who haven't agonized over their atheism to the degree that most of us have. We're going to see more atheists who haven't spent long, dark nights of the soul, or the soulless, I guess I should say, pondering what it means to be a good person, or what the meaning of life might be when there's no God and no afterlife, and all we are is matter and energy arranged in an unusual way. We're going to see more atheists who aren't any better informed about world religions than most believers are. As we succeed in making the world an easier place to be an atheist, we're going to see more atheists who aren't amazingly brave and strong, tough and independent, passionate and confident and funny. We're going to see more atheists who are pretty much just regular folks who just want to get on with their lives. And we have to be prepared for that. And we have to not let our current amazingness go to our heads. We have to not succumb to elitism. We have to not fool ourselves into thinking that our amazingness comes from anything other than the difficulty of coming out and the powerful self-selecting filter that this creates. We have to be prepared for the day when we are no longer special. When a movement becomes more mainstream, for people who enjoy living on the fringe, that can be a bitter pill to swallow. And I count myself as one of those people, fringe liver over here. And as LGBT culture has gotten folded into the larger culture over the years, there is something special that's being lost, and I do sometimes feel sad about that. And when that happens with the atheist community, as I believe it will, and as I actually ardently hope it will, I'll probably feel sad about that too. But we have to remember this. And again, this is something we learned from the history of the LGBT movement. Mainstreaming does not mean that we have been swallowed by the maw of mainstream society. Mainstreaming means that we have changed mainstream society. The LGBT community has changed as it's become more mainstream, but mainstream society has changed too. Society today is not what it was when the LGBT movement was getting off the ground 40 years ago. And I don't just mean attitudes of straight people towards LGBT people. I mean attitudes of straight people towards themselves. The way that mainstream society deals with sex and gender and family, how they define family, how they feel about their bodies, that's different today as a result of LGBT people being folded into mainstream society. I see this especially in young people today. I see a lot more fluidity about sexuality and gender roles, less of a need for clearly marked sexual orientation labels, less bickering about what's gay or lesbian or straight. A greater comfort with same-sex attraction in people who are more or less straight. There has, in fact, been a paradigm shift. It just doesn't look like the radical queer utopia envisioned by the queer theorists of the 70s and 80s. But mainstream straight culture has changed as a result of the LGBT community becoming more mainstream. And I suspect that the same thing will happen with atheism. As our movement progresses over the years and decades, as atheism becomes both more accepted and more common, we're not going to see a rationalist utopia in which evidence and reason are king. I'm really sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but human nature is what it is, and even if atheists became completely accepted into society, even if church and state got completely separated, even if nobody ever tried to cram religion down people's throat by the force of violence or law ever again, even if religion completely disappeared from the human mindset and became a historical relic, human nature will still be human nature, and people will still be wired with cognitive errors we evolved 100,000 years ago to help us find food and escape from predators, and people will still believe silly things for no good reason, even if those things aren't religion. What we may see, however, is a world where the common assumptions about religion are very different from the ones that people have now. We may see a world where people don't automatically assume that everyone is religious, just like we're beginning to see a world where people don't automatically assume that everyone is straight. Beginning to see. We may see a world where atheists are recognized as ethical, happy, trustworthy contributors to society, just like we're beginning to see a world where LGBT people are recognized as ethical, happy, trustworthy contributors to society. We may see a world where religion is a lot less structured and less centered in religious organizations and a lot more fluid and personal. Just like we're beginning to see a world where gender and sexual orientation is more fluid and more personal. We may see a world where religion isn't automatically granted special privileged status, but is seen as just another hypothesis about the world that can be questioned and criticized, just like any other hypothesis. Just like we're beginning to see a world where heterosexuality isn't automatically granted special privileged status, but is simply seen as one of the many ways that people can be sexual and loving together. If this happens, if we really can push the world in that direction, it will be totally worth it. And if we continue to learn from the lessons of the LGBT movement, I have confidence that we can make that happen. Thank you.